I was 15 the night I learned what abandonment really felt like. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed above me as I sat on a plastic chair, clutching a paper cup of water that had long since gone warm. My mother had walked out with the promise of coming back in just a minute. She never returned. Hours passed, and the silence grew louder than any words she had ever spoken. That chair became the place where my childhood ended. People often imagine betrayal as something sudden and sharp, like a blade cutting through trust. For me, it was slower, heavier, like ice forming over a river until you can no longer remember the sound of water moving underneath. I sat in that hospital waiting, believing for far too long that the door would open and she would smile as if nothing had happened. But the door never opened, and I never saw her face again, not for many years. Before I tell you the rest of this journey, let me pause for a moment. If stories like mine move you, if you want to walk alongside the voices of women who carried pain and turned it into strength, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. That way you will never miss the next chapter of resilience and courage we bring to life here. Now let me take you back to that hallway. I remember the nurse who finally touched my shoulder and asked where my mother had gone. I remember the way her eyes softened when I could not answer. In that moment, I became more than a girl with a stomachache. I became a case file, a ward of the state, another lost teenager drifting into the foster system. Yet beneath the grief, there was a small spark that refused to go out. I carried that spark into every unfamiliar house, every whispered conversation about me that I was not meant to hear. It was the same spark that lit when a teacher told me about a program called Junior Rock. For the first time since that night, I felt the weight in my chest lift, just slightly. I discovered discipline, order, and a strange kind of belonging among uniforms and drills. It was there that I first believed I could be more than the girl left behind. 10 years later, I would wear a different uniform, one stitched with the flag of my country. I would serve in places where the heat and dust pressed against my skin, where I held the hands of sisters in arms and whispered promises we could not always keep. I had become a soldier, a woman forged in fire, shaped by loss and strengthened by duty. And then, one ordinary afternoon, the door opened again. Not the hospital door from my childhood, but the door of a cafe where I sat with steady hands and a steady heart. On the other side was the woman who had left me behind. She came with tears and apologies and a desperate plea for forgiveness. That was the moment everything I had built was tested. Would I let the past reclaim me, or would I walk forward with the strength I had earned? I remember the way the hospital smelled that night. Sharp, sterile, almost metallic, as if the air itself was scrubbed clean of any warmth. I was 15 years old, curled into myself on a stiff cot with the echo of pain still lingering in my stomach. My mother had rushed me here, her voice tight with worry at first, her hand gripping mine so hard I thought she would never let go. I believed her fear meant love. I believed her presence meant safety. When the doctor assured us that I would be fine, just a minor infection that needed fluids and rest, my mother exhaled, her shoulders dropping with relief. She smoothed my hair back and whispered that she would get some water from the vending machine. She smiled faintly, a little too quickly, and promised she would be back in just a minute. That was the last time I saw her. Minutes stretched into hours, each one heavier than the last. I stared at the door, waiting for it to swing open, waiting for the familiar figure of my mother to return. Every set of footsteps in the hallway made my heart leap, but it was always someone else. A nurse checking vitals, an orderly pushing a cart, a stranger walking past with their own burdens. Not her. The water she promised never came. The warmth of her hand never returned. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the truth began to seep into me, cold and merciless. She was not coming back. There is a moment when hope fractures. It is not loud. It is not even dramatic. It is a quiet breaking, like glass splintering beneath a thin layer of dust. My hope shattered in that hallway, leaving me with nothing but the sharp edges of disbelief. I sat there with the weight of absence pressing against my chest, and I felt myself change. I was no longer just a daughter. I was no longer just a child who could assume love would always wait outside the door. I was abandoned. Sometimes I wonder if you, listening now, have ever felt that kind of silence. The silence of waiting for someone who never arrives. Have you ever sat in a place where the world kept moving while your heart stayed frozen, hoping for footsteps that never came? If you have, I invite you to share it in the comments below. Your story may help someone else realize they are not alone. When the nurse finally noticed me sitting too still, she asked gently where my mother had gone. My throat closed around the answer I could not give. My eyes filled, but no words came. She crouched down to meet my gaze, her face soft with pity, and I saw in her expression that she already knew. They called social services that night. By dawn, I was no longer Lily Morgan, daughter of a mother who would one day return. I was Lily Morgan, ward of the state, shuffled into a system built to catch children like me before they slipped too far into the cracks. The first foster home smelled like fried onions and laundry soap. The couple who greeted me smiled politely, but their eyes held exhaustion. I was another responsibility added to a long list, another mouth to feed at the table. They gave me a small room with a bed that sagged in the middle. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if my mother was asleep somewhere warm, if she thought of me, if regret ever touched her. It is a cruel thing, the way the mind clings to those who wound us most deeply. I told myself stories to survive, whispers of excuses for why she left. Maybe she got lost. Maybe she was hurt herself. Maybe she thought she was sparing me from her own brokenness. But as the weeks turned into months, those excuses grew thinner, more fragile, until they dissolved into the truth. She chose to walk away. Living in foster care was like standing on shifting ground. Each house had its own rules, its own smells, its own tensions simmering beneath the surface. I learned quickly how to adapt, how to become quiet enough not to stir resentment, how to smile just enough to be tolerated. But inside me, the anger began to grow. Anger can be fuel. It can keep you moving when despair tries to pin you down. But it can also consume, turning everything in its path into ash. At 15, I did not yet know how to wield it. I only knew how to carry it, heavy and hot, pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. The school I attended was large and impersonal. I walked the halls with my shoulders squared, pretending the whispers did not sting. Other kids had parents waiting at the curb after class. Other kids had family dinners, vacations, traditions. I had a caseworker and a file. One afternoon, a teacher named Mr. Jacobs noticed me lingering in the back of the classroom. He was the kind of man who carried authority without needing to raise his voice. He asked me if I had ever considered joining Junior ROTC. I shrugged, uninterested at first, but he persisted. He told me it was not just about marching or uniforms. It was about discipline, belonging, and finding a place where broken edges could be forged into strength. At that time, I did not believe in belonging, but something in his words stayed with me. Do you believe that one person can change the entire direction of your life with a single suggestion? Think about it for a moment. Has someone ever spoken a few words that altered your path completely? If so, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Sometimes sharing those turning points reminds us how powerful even small acts of guidance can be. When I showed up to the first J-Rock meeting, I expected to feel out of place, and I did. The uniform felt stiff on my shoulders. The drills felt foreign, almost absurd at first. But there was rhythm in the marching, a cadence that seeped into me. For the first time since that night in the hospital, I felt anchored. I did not know it then, but that program would become the bridge between the girl who was left behind and the woman I would one day become. Still, those first nights in foster care were long and sleepless. I would lie awake, listening to the creaks of a house that did not feel like mine, and replay the memory of my mother's smile before she left. That fleeting smile haunted me. Was it relief that I was safe, or relief that she was finally free of me? Grief has many stages, but abandonment adds its own cruel twist. It convinces you that you were not enough, that if you had been different, better, easier to love, they would have stayed. I carried that weight like a stone in my pocket, heavy and unyielding. Years later, I would come to understand that her leaving said more about her than it ever did about me. But at 15, all I could see was my own supposed failure reflected in the empty doorway of that hospital room. I want to ask you something, and I hope you will answer in the comments if you feel comfortable. When you look back at your hardest moments, do you remember the exact instant when you realized life would never be the same? For me, it was the silence after the door closed. For you, it might be something entirely different. Sharing those memories can be painful, but it can also remind others that resilience is possible. As the weeks passed, I began to understand that waiting for my mother was a waste of breath. She was not coming back. No phone call, no letter, no sudden reappearance at my school plays or birthdays. The absence was total. The absence became its own kind of presence. I began to craft a new version of myself, one who did not need her, one who could walk into the J-Rock room and hold her chin high, even when her heart was breaking. One who could take the weight of abandonment and hammer it into armor. But armor is heavy. And sometimes, when the lights were out and the house was quiet, I would let myself remember the little girl I had been before that night. The girl who laughed easily. The girl who believed her mother's arms were the safest place on earth. That girl was gone, buried beneath layers of silence and resilience. Still, somewhere deep inside, a spark flickered. A refusal to be defined only by loss. That spark would one day grow into a fire strong enough to carry me into the military, into deserts and battlefields and bonds of sisterhood I never imagined possible. But in those early days, it was just a fragile ember, kept alive by sheer will. Foster care was not a single story. It was a collection of mismatched chapters, each one with different settings, different characters, different rules. Some homes smelled like comfort and carried the echo of kindness. Others carried tension so thick you could taste it before the front door even closed. I learned quickly to adjust my posture, to watch for cues, to survive in silence. There were nights when I sat at kitchen tables where no one spoke to me. Other nights I joined families who prayed before dinner and slipped extra biscuits onto my plate when they thought I was still hungry. I was grateful for kindness, but even in those gentler homes, I felt like a guest wearing borrowed clothes. No matter how many roofs covered me, none felt like home. Home was a word that belonged to other people. For me, it was always temporary, always fragile, always one argument away from being told to pack my bag. School became my constant. The halls, the lockers, the predictable rhythm of bells. That was where I could at least pretend to be like everyone else. But I carried the invisible mark of being a foster kid. People sensed it. Teachers eyed me with cautious sympathy. Students whispered when they thought I could not hear. It was in that restless place of not belonging that J-Rock became my anchor. At first it was awkward, stepping into a room filled with order when my life felt like chaos, but the structure steadied me. The sound of boots striking the gym floor in unison, the sharp commands, the crisp turn of heads. For a girl who had been left behind, there was power in moving with a group, in belonging to a rhythm larger than herself. Mr. Jacobs, the teacher who had nudged me toward the program, became more than an instructor. He became a quiet mentor. He noticed when I carried myself straighter, when I pushed through drills with more focus than before. One afternoon after practice, he stopped me and said, "You know, leadership is not about being the loudest voice. Sometimes it is about standing firm when everyone else wavers." I did not fully understand his words then, but they settled into me like seeds waiting for the right season to grow. Do you remember a moment when someone saw strength in you that you could not yet see in yourself? It can be such a gift, and sometimes it changes the way you walk into the world. If you have a memory like that, I would love if you shared it in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. Still, outside of the drills and uniforms, I struggled. Foster homes rotated. Sometimes it was my choice, sometimes it was theirs. I was too quiet, too guarded, too angry beneath the surface. I saw other kids in the system give up entirely, slipping through school with vacant stares, running away to chase the illusion of freedom. Part of me understood their urge, but another part clung to J-Rock, to that spark of belonging. I poured myself into it. I studied the manuals, practiced the drills, volunteered for extra responsibilities. It was not just about looking sharp in a uniform. It was about proving to myself that I could be disciplined, that I could be strong, that I was not defined by the night in the hospital when my world collapsed. Over time, my efforts were noticed. By the end of my sophomore year, I was selected for a leadership position over a small squad. At first, I felt undeserving. Who was I to guide anyone else? But as I stood at the front, calling out commands, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time, people followed not because they had to, but because they trusted me. Leadership did not erase my pain, but it gave it purpose. It gave me a direction to channel the anger that once threatened to burn me alive. And yet, when the drills ended and I returned to whatever foster home I was in that month, the loneliness remained. I would sit on the edge of my bed, laces still tight on my boots, and imagine a world where my mother had chosen differently. I would imagine her in the stands, watching me march, clapping as if I was her pride. The ache of her absence was sharpest in those moments. People often think healing is a straight line. It is not. Healing is a spiral. You circle back to the same wound again and again, but each time you pass it, you are a little stronger, a little steadier. At 15, 16, 17, I was still circling, still learning how to carry both the ache and the strength it gave me. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever carried a memory that returns when you least expect it? A memory that hurts and yet somehow fuels your strength? If you feel comfortable, share it below. Others might find comfort knowing they are not alone in that cycle. As the years of high school moved forward, J-Rock became my compass. It was the one place where my past did not define me. My squad respected me because of how I showed up each day, not because of who my parents were or where I came from. In that space, I began to believe in a future that was bigger than foster care, bigger than abandonment. I started to think about the military, about serving for real. It felt impossible at first, like a dream reserved for kids with families cheering them on. But the thought would not leave me. I would watch recruiters visit the school and wonder if I could be one of the names on their lists. I wanted purpose. I wanted to belong to something permanent, something stronger than the fragility of my childhood. That dream carried me through my final years in foster care. Each house still held its challenges. Each goodbye still stung, but I was no longer drifting. I had a direction. I had a plan. Looking back now, I can see that chapter 1 of my life closed in that hospital hallway. And though the years that followed were filled with instability, they also planted the seeds of resilience. Without those years, without the sting of abandonment and the shifting ground of foster care, I might never have discovered the fire inside me. And that fire would one day carry me far beyond the walls of a high school gym. It would carry me into the deserts of a war zone, into the bond of sisterhood with women who wore the same uniform, into the moment years later when I would face my mother again with unshaken eyes. But all of that still waited in the distance. For now, I was just Lily Morgan, 15 years old, a foster kid with a fractured heart, standing a little taller each day in a borrowed uniform, learning that even the abandoned can lead. The first time I walked into the J-Rot classroom, I felt as though I had stepped into another world. The room smelled faintly of floor polish and chalk dust, but what struck me most were the framed photographs lining the walls. Young men and women in uniform, frozen in time with steady gazes, medals pinned to their chests. They seemed so sure of themselves, so rooted in belonging. I felt like an imposter wandering into a place where certainty lived. My hands fidgeted with the hem of my shirt as cadets filed in around me, their laughter echoing, their movements already practiced. I wanted to shrink, to vanish into the background. Yet something in me also ached to belong to that rhythm. It was the same longing that had followed me since that night in the hospital, the desire to anchor myself to something solid, something unshakable. Mister Jacobs greeted me with a nod that carried no pity, only expectation. That was what I craved most in those days, someone who looked at me without sorrow or judgment. He handed me a uniform, crisp and neatly folded. I held it like it was fragile glass, afraid that the moment I touched it, someone would realize I did not deserve it. I tried it on that evening in the foster home bathroom. The fabric was stiff, the sleeves a little too long, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone else staring back. Not just a girl who had been left behind, but someone who might one day lead. The first drills were clumsy. I tripped over my own feet, my voice cracked when calling cadence, and I flushed crimson when others laughed softly at my mistakes. But repetition became rhythm. The sound of boots striking the gym floor, the unison of arms swinging, the call and response of commands. It seeped into me, steady and grounding. For the first time in years, I felt like part of a whole. Do you remember a moment when you tried something new and felt clumsy at first, but slowly realized you were stronger than you thought? Those stories always inspire me, and if you are comfortable, share yours in the comments. It might encourage someone else to keep going through their own awkward beginning. The more time I spent in J-Rock, the more I discovered corners of myself I did not know existed. Discipline became my shield. Order became my refuge. The chaos of foster care faded a little when I put on that uniform. Each neatly pressed crease felt like a promise that I was not defined by where I came from, but by how I chose to stand. By my junior year, I was no longer the quiet girl lurking at the back. I had been promoted to squad leader, entrusted with guiding others. The first time I stood before them, my stomach twisted with nerves. What if they saw through me? What if they knew that inside I was still the girl abandoned on a hospital chair? But then I remembered what Mr. Jacobs once said, that leadership was not about being the loudest voice. It was about being steady when others faltered. So I lifted my chin, called the commands, and felt the group move as one. In that moment, the noise of self-doubt quieted. I belonged. Yet belonging did not erase the old wounds. After practice, when I returned to the foster home, the silence still pressed against me. The other kids had parents coming to watch their ceremonies, clapping in the stands. My section of the bleachers was always empty. I scanned the crowd anyway, hoping against reason. Hope is a stubborn thing, even when you wish you could let it go. I want to ask you something. Have you ever looked for a face in the crowd that you knew would not be there? That mix of hope and heartbreak can be unbearable. If you have, you are not alone. Feel free to share your story below if you want to. Your voice matters here. Despite the ache, J-Rock became the one place I could breathe freely. I worked harder than most because I had more to prove, at least to myself. I signed up for extra drills, volunteered to mentor younger cadets, studied the manuals late into the night. It was not ambition that drove me. It was survival. If I could be strong here, maybe I could survive anywhere. Mr. Jacobs noticed. One day he pulled me aside and told me he saw something in me that reminded him of his own daughter. Not pity, but pride. I carried his words like armor. In a world where adults often looked at me with resignation, his belief gave me something I desperately needed: permission to believe in myself. By senior year, I had become captain of the female drill team. The first time we performed at a regional competition, my hands trembled as we lined up. But when I shouted the first command and the cadence of 20 boots struck the floor in unison, my fear melted into focus. We moved like one body, one heartbeat. And when the crowd applauded, I felt a swell of pride that was deeper than anything I had known. I thought about how far I had come from that hospital hallway, from silence and abandonment to the sound of applause, from being invisible to leading others. And for the first time, I allowed myself to dream beyond high school. The dream was fragile at first. It whispered of uniforms not just pressed for drills, but for real service. It whispered of belonging not just for 4 years of J-Rock, but for life. Could I serve in the military? Could I build a future where my strength was not just survival, but purpose? At night, lying on a narrow foster bed, I wrestled with the questions. I did not have parents to co-sign my forms, no one to sit beside me with a recruiter. But I had something stronger. I had the certainty that I could not go back to the girl waiting in silence. I had to move forward, even if the path was uncertain. Have you ever stood at the edge of a dream that felt too big for you? That space between fear and possibility can be terrifying. But it can also be where we discover our true selves. If you feel comfortable, share a dream you once thought was too big but chased anyway. Your courage might ignite someone else's. As graduation loomed, I pressed the fabric of my J-Rock uniform between my fingers and imagined the weight of a real one. I was still that abandoned girl in many ways, but I was also more. I was a leader. I was resilient. I was ready. And though I could not yet see it, the next chapter of my life was waiting just beyond the horizon. The closer I came to graduation, the sharper the divide in my life became. On one side stood the girl who had been left behind in a hospital hallway, shuffled through foster homes with a suitcase that never gathered dust. On the other stood the cadet in pressed uniform, boots aligned with precision, a voice strong enough to command others. I was both, yet I longed to leave one behind forever. Foster care had taught me lessons no classroom ever could. It taught me how to read tension in a room, how to pack a bag in minutes, how to build walls so high no one could see the cracks underneath. Some homes were kind but distant, others indifferent, a few hostile. I remember one placement where the foster father glared at me for the smallest mistakes, his silence sharper than words. I learned to tiptoe around the edges of his anger, retreating into my room where I clutched J-Rock manuals like lifelines. Another home was filled with children younger than me, loud and restless, clamoring for attention. I often ended up caring for them, braiding their hair, helping with homework, wiping away tears. They looked at me with trust I did not think I deserved. I wanted to protect them from the emptiness I knew too well, but I could not even protect myself. When I left that home, their little faces pressed to the window, it was another fracture added to my heart. In each place, J-Rock remained the one constant. The program was more than drills and uniforms. It was a family of choice, a circle of belonging that did not vanish when the placement changed. No matter where I slept at night, I knew that come morning, I would march in step with cadets who counted on me. That rhythm became my anchor, steady even when everything else shifted. Do you know what it feels like to hold on to one small thing that keeps you steady while the rest of your life feels unstable? It might be music, or a book, or a group of people. For me, it was the cadence of boots on the gym floor. What is it for you? If you would like, share it in the comments. Someone else might need the reminder that stability can be found in unexpected places. By the spring of my senior year, I had become someone people turned to. Younger cadets came with questions, teachers trusted me with responsibilities, and Mr. Jacobs told me I had leadership potential that could take me far beyond high school. His words planted a seed that grew quickly. The military was no longer just a distant idea. It became a goal, a destination. Still, doubt crept in at night. Could a girl like me, without parents, without a home to return to, really make it? I pictured the recruiters' faces when I told them my story. Would they see strength, or just another foster kid with too much baggage? I spent hours researching requirements. I discovered that my status as a ward of the state meant I could still provide the necessary documents through my caseworker. Relief mixed with determination. The obstacles were real, but not insurmountable. I began to believe that the uniform I wore in J-Rock was only the beginning. At the same time, I carried the ache of absence more keenly than ever. When award ceremonies came, I walked across the stage to applause, but the seat where family should have been sat empty. I told myself I did not care, that I had grown used to it. But the truth is, emptiness echoes. It echoed louder in those moments, when triumph should have tasted sweeter. I sometimes wondered if my mother ever thought of me. Did she imagine the girl she left behind growing into someone strong? Or did she bury the memory, convincing herself I had vanished with the past? The questions circled like restless birds, never landing, never leaving. If you have ever been haunted by questions with no answers, you know how heavy that silence can be. Sometimes it helps to voice them, even if the answers never come. If you want, share in the comments a question from your past that still lingers. You might find that speaking it aloud lessens its weight. Despite the ache, I pushed harder. I joined weekend training, volunteered for community service projects, and took every chance to lead. Leadership became not only a role but a shield. When I stood in front of others, I was no longer the abandoned girl. I was Captain Morgan, steady and unyielding. There was a drill meet in the fall of my senior year that I will never forget. Our team traveled hours by bus, uniforms pressed, nerves taut. We lined up in the echoing gymnasium, other schools watching, judges with clipboards. As I shouted the first command, my voice did not tremble. The team moved like one heartbeat, sharp and precise. When we finished, the applause roared. We placed first. That victory was not just a trophy. It was proof that I could turn pain into discipline, abandonment into belonging. It was proof that I could carry others with me, that my brokenness had not made me weak, but strong. Afterward, Mr. Jacobs pulled me aside. His eyes glistened with pride as he told me that the way I had led was something rare, something that came not from ease but from hardship. He told me to consider the Air Force, that my attention to detail, my steadiness under pressure, would serve me well there. The suggestion rooted itself deep inside me. I walked home from that competition with my head high. For once, I did not care that no one waited for me at the curb. I was already walking toward a future that belonged entirely to me. Still, the foster system had one more lesson to teach. A month before graduation, my placement dissolved. The foster parents decided they could not manage a teenager preparing to leave. I found myself packing again, sliding my belongings into the same battered suitcase. But this time was different. I was not being sent adrift without direction. I knew where I was going. I moved into a group home for older teens. It was crowded, noisy, and often chaotic, but I barely noticed. My focus was fixed on the path ahead. I had already met with a recruiter. The paperwork had begun. I was weeks away from stepping into the next chapter. At night, lying in a narrow bed surrounded by the snores and whispers of other girls, I thought about the uniform waiting for me. Not the J-Rock one, but the real one, stitched with the flag of my country. I thought about the weight of it on my shoulders, the oath I would take, the purpose it would give me. And for the first time since I was 15, I felt something like peace. I want to ask you as we close this chapter, have you ever reached a moment where you could look back and see that every struggle, every heartbreak had been shaping you for something greater? It does not erase the pain, but it gives it meaning. If you have felt that, I invite you to share it. Someone else listening might find hope in your journey. That summer, when I stood at graduation in my cap and gown, I did not search the crowd for my mother. I knew she would not be there. Instead, I lifted my eyes to the horizon, already picturing the base where I would soon report. The girl who had been left in a hospital hallway was gone. In her place stood a young woman ready to claim her future. And though I did not yet know it, the road ahead would be harder than anything I had faced. It would test me in deserts and deployments, in the loss of friends, and the burden of responsibility. But the foundation had been laid. Foster care had hardened me. J-Rock had shaped me. And the fire inside me would carry me into the life of a soldier. I was 18 when I stood in front of the recruiter's desk, my hands damp with nerves. The paperwork spread out like a map to a future I had only dared to imagine. My caseworker sat beside me, nodding at each signature, ensuring the documents were in order. For so long, I had feared that missing pieces of my past would hold me back, but the state had gathered what I needed. A birth certificate, a social security number, records that proved I existed not only in memory, but in the eyes of the law. The recruiter looked me over with a practiced eye, sizing up whether I had the steel to follow through. When he asked why I wanted to join, I could have told him 1,000 things. That I was tired of drifting, that I wanted to belong, that I wanted to trade the silence of foster homes for the roar of something greater than myself. Instead, I simply said, I want to serve. The words felt both small and immense, as if they held a weight I would spend years unpacking. Within weeks, I was on a bus heading to basic training. The ride was long, filled with young men and women clutching small duffels, their faces taut with anticipation. Some whispered about leaving girlfriends behind, others joked nervously, their laughter brittle at the edges. I sat near the window, watching the world blur past, my chest tight with a mix of fear and determination. For the first time, my destination was not another foster home. It was a place I had chosen. The first night at training was chaos. Yelling, commands, boots slamming against tile floors. We were stripped of individuality, reduced to shaved heads for the men, strict buns for the women, identical uniforms, identical schedules. At first it felt suffocating, like being swallowed by a machine. But beneath the barked orders and relentless pace, I sensed a different truth. We were being broken down not to be discarded, but to be rebuilt. I learned quickly that the military cared little for excuses. If you failed, you tried again. If you stumbled, you got back up. Tears were wasted breath. Complaints evaporated under the weight of discipline. My body ached from push-ups, my voice cracked from calling cadence, my feet blistered until they hardened. Yet each day I stood a little taller, my lungs filled with a new kind of strength. I had always carried scars from my past, invisible but heavy. Basic training did not erase them, but it transformed the way I bore them. Pain was no longer something that defined me. It was something I could move through, something I could use. Every blister, every muscle trembling in exhaustion became proof that I was no longer powerless. Do you remember a moment when hardship transformed you, when the very thing that broke you also built you? If you feel comfortable, share it below. Sometimes telling those stories gives someone else the courage to push through their own breaking point. One of the hardest lessons was trust. In foster care, trust was fragile, easily shattered. But in training, survival depended on it. We marched in formation, slept in shared barracks, endured grueling drills where one person's mistake meant punishment for all. Slowly, I began to lean on the people around me, and they leaned on me in return. For the first time since I was a child, I felt the stirrings of family. Not the kind bound by blood, but by sweat, discipline, and shared struggle. There was a woman in my flight named Rivera. She was fierce, with dark eyes that missed nothing, a laugh that cracked through the hardest days. We were paired often, pushing each other through runs, sharing whispered encouragement in the dark hours before dawn. Rivera reminded me of the girls I had once braided hair for in a noisy foster home, but stronger, bolder, as if she carried all of us who had ever been left behind. When graduation day arrived, I stood at attention in uniform, my chest swelling as the band played and our families cheered from the bleachers. My section of the stands was empty, as it had always been, but for the first time it did not sting the same way. I was not alone. Rivera stood beside me, the flight stood behind me, and I knew I was part of something that could not be taken away. The oath we took bound us not only to our country, but to one another. As I raised my right hand and spoke the words, I felt a thread tighten in my chest. The girl abandoned at 15 had been reshaped into an airman. My scars did not vanish, but they gleamed like polished metal, proof of endurance. After basic training came technical school, where we learned the skills that would define our roles. I chose logistics, drawn to the precision of managing supplies, ensuring that what was needed arrived where it mattered most. It was not glamorous, but it was essential, and I found satisfaction in the order of it. In every box packed, every shipment tracked, I saw echoes of the order J-Rock had given me, but on a larger, more urgent scale. The first time I donned my full uniform with insignia, I studied myself in the mirror. The reflection was both familiar and foreign. My eyes still carried the memory of abandonment, but my stance was unyielding, steady. I had become someone new, forged in discipline, steadied by purpose. I want to ask you as you listen, have you ever looked in the mirror and realized you were no longer who you once were? That the person staring back carried both the old scars and a new strength? If you have had that moment, consider sharing it. It might help someone else recognize their own transformation. Life on base was not easy. Early mornings, long hours, the weight of responsibility pressing against us every day. But it was a life I chose, and that made all the difference. Each challenge was a reminder that I had stepped into this path with open eyes. The bonds with my fellow airmen deepened. Rivera and I often shared late-night conversations in the barracks, our voices low as we talked about the families we came from, the reasons we enlisted. She spoke of wanting to break a cycle of poverty, of creating a new story for herself. I spoke less often, but when I did, she listened without judgment. In her presence, the silence of my past loosened its grip. The first deployment orders arrived like a drumbeat. My name was on the list. We were heading to the Middle East, to a place whose heat and dust I could barely imagine. Fear flickered inside me, but beneath it was something stronger. Purpose. I had trained for this. I had chosen this. The night before we left, Rivera sat beside me under the wide Texas sky. Stars stretched endlessly, cold and distant. She nudged my shoulder and said, "We made it this far. Whatever comes next, we face it together." I nodded, the lump in my throat too heavy for words. Together. The word was a bomb, a promise. That deployment would change everything. It would test me in ways I could not yet grasp. It would strip me bare and leave me carrying a loss I still feel today. But standing under those stars, I did not know that yet. All I knew was that the girl who once clutched a paper cup of water in a hospital hallway was now a woman with boots laced tight, ready to walk into the unknown. The desert heat wrapped around me like a second skin the moment I stepped off the transport plane. It was the kind of heat that seared into your lungs, that coated every breath with dust. The airbase stretched out under a bleached sky, the roar of engines mixing with the steady hum of a place built for endurance rather than comfort. This was no training ground. This was real. I carried my duffel on my shoulder, boots sinking into the sand-packed earth, and felt the weight of the moment press down on me. I was no longer a cadet pretending in a high school gym. I was an airman standing in a war zone, one thread in a vast, fragile web of people depending on each other to survive. The days blurred quickly into routine. Early mornings filled with briefings, long hours coordinating supplies, ensuring that shipments moved to the right units at the right time. Precision mattered here. A mistake on a form, a delay in a truck's arrival, could mean that soldiers went without water, ammunition, or medical equipment. I took the responsibility seriously, poring over every detail until the numbers lined up perfectly. At night, the base quieted but never truly slept. The sound of distant engines, the occasional crack of gunfire in the distance, reminded us of the fragility of our safety. We slept lightly, boots by the cot, ready to move at a moment's notice. Rivera was my anchor. We had promised to face this together, and in the desert that promise became our lifeline. She carried herself with confidence that bordered on defiance, cracking jokes when tension thickened, offering quiet strength when fear gnawed at the edges of our resolve. We ate together in the mess hall, shared stories during rare breaks, and leaned against each other when exhaustion threatened to pull us under. One evening, after a long day of sorting supply manifests, we sat outside the barracks watching the horizon bleed into twilight. Rivera lit a cigarette, the ember glowing against the dark. She exhaled and said, "Funny how life turns out." We both started as girls who felt invisible, and here we are in the middle of the desert, holding up half the sky. I laughed softly, but the truth in her words struck deep. We were far from invisible. We mattered. I want to ask you something. Have you ever found family in someone who was not related to you by blood? Someone who stepped into the space where others had failed? Those connections can save us in ways we never expect. If you have someone like that, consider honoring them in the comments. Your story might remind someone else of the power of chosen family. The mission tempo increased as weeks passed. Convoys moved supplies beyond the safety of the base, into areas where the risk was sharper, the roads lined with shadows. Rivera volunteered often, insisting she could not sit idle while others carried the burden. I admired her courage, though it worried me. She said it was not about bravery, but about doing her part. Then came the day that split my life into before and after. Rivera's convoy was scheduled to deliver critical supplies to a forward operating unit. She stopped by my workstation that morning, grinning as always, and tossed me a piece of gum. "Save me some coffee for when I get back," she said. I teased her about her terrible taste in jokes, and she rolled her eyes before heading out. Hours later, the news came. The convoy had been hit. An explosion tore through the lead vehicle, chaos unfolding in seconds. Rivera had been in the second truck. She did not make it back. The words sank into me like stones, heavy and impossible to swallow. I sat frozen, the forms on my desk blurring into meaningless ink. My chest constricted until I could barely breathe. The world outside the tent kept moving, engines rumbling, voices shouting, but inside me everything went silent. Grief is a strange thing in war. There is no room for collapse, no pause to cradle the loss. The mission continues, supplies must move, the living must keep going. But inside I was unraveling. Rivera had been my anchor, my mirror, my reminder that we were not alone. Without her, I felt like the sand would swallow me whole. That night, I lay on my cot staring at the canvas ceiling, the desert wind rattling against the walls. I thought of Rivera's laughter, the way she called us sky holders, the way she always lit the darkness with defiance. I wanted to scream, to demand why she had been taken, why the world could be so cruel to those who gave everything. But no answer came, only the silence of absence, the same silence I had once known in a hospital hallway. The next morning, I put on my uniform and went back to work. My hands trembled over the manifests, my vision blurred, but I forced myself to keep going. Rivera would not return, but others depended on me. Supplies had to move. Lives depended on it. That was when I realized something that would shape me forever. Survival was not enough. Living only for myself was not enough. Rivera's life had been cut short, but her courage, her laughter, her fire could live on in me. I could carry her forward, not as a shadow, but as part of the light that guided me. Do you know that feeling when you lose someone and suddenly every choice you make carries their weight too? When you breathe for both of you, walk for both of you, live for both of you. If you have felt that, I would be honored if you shared a piece of it. Your story might help others who are carrying the same burden. From that day forward, I carried Rivera with me. Every shipment I checked, every convoy I supported, every step I marched in formation. She was there in the cadence of boots, in the laughter that echoed despite the dust, in the courage to keep going when grief threatened to paralyze me. Months later, when my deployment ended, I returned home changed. The world looked the same, but I no longer was. I had seen how quickly life could be stolen, how fragile each day truly was. I had carried loss into my bones, but I had also carried resilience. I stepped off the plane onto American soil with my boots heavy with desert sand. I thought of the girl who once sat in a hospital hallway waiting for a mother who never came back. That girl was still inside me, but she was no longer abandoned. She had found a family in her comrades, found purpose in service, found strength in carrying the memory of those who had fallen. As I walked across the tarmac, the sun setting behind me, I whispered a promise to Rivera. I will live not only for myself, but for you. I will carry your laughter into every dark place. I will hold up the sky for both of us. And with that vow, the path ahead stretched clear. 12 years had passed since that night in the hospital hallway. 12 years since I had watched a door close and never open again. By then, I had lived a dozen lives. I had been a foster child, a cadet, an airman, a soldier in the desert who carried the weight of both survival and loss. I had learned to stand on my own 2 feet, to march forward even when grief clawed at my ribs. I thought I had left that girl behind. But ghosts have a way of finding their way back. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in a cafe near the base, uniform pressed, my hair neatly tied back, sipping coffee as I reviewed paperwork. The place was filled with the quiet hum of conversations, the clatter of cups against saucers. Nothing about that day suggested my life was about to tilt on its axis. Then I heard my name, not Morgan, not Airman, not Captain. The name only one person had ever called me with that particular tone. Lily. I froze, the cup halfway to my lips. Slowly I turned, and there she was, my mother. Time had not been kind. Her hair was streaked with gray, her shoulders stooped, her eyes swollen as if she had spent hours crying. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. For a long moment we stared at each other, the space between us thick with 12 years of silence. I wanted to feel nothing. I wanted to be stone. But my heart betrayed me, pounding against my ribs as if it recognized her before my mind would allow it. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. Lily, my baby. The words sliced through me. Baby. The last time I had been her baby was the night she walked out. I set my cup down carefully, my hands trembling. My mouth was dry, but I managed to speak. What are you doing here? She sank into the chair across from me, her hands twisting together. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I have thought about this moment for years. I prayed for it, begged for the chance to see you again. I need to explain. Explain. The word echoed inside me like an insult. For 12 years I had lived with no explanation, only silence. Now she wanted to give me one. She took a deep breath, her voice breaking. That night I was drowning. I was broke, alone, sick in my mind. I thought I could not raise you. I thought you would be better off without me. I told myself leaving you there was mercy. But it was cowardice. I see that now. Her confession hung in the air, raw and trembling. I sat rigid, my mind split in two. One part of me was the soldier who had faced down loss in the desert, who had built a life from ashes. The other was the 15-year-old girl abandoned in a hospital hallway, still waiting for footsteps that never came. Both versions of me screamed in conflict. She reached across the table, her hand shaking. "Lily, I am begging you. Just one word. Call me Mom. Forgive me once." Her tears fell freely, her shoulders shaking with the force of her plea. People around us glanced over, curious but quickly turned away. To them, it was just another scene of messy family drama in a quiet cafe. To me, it was the earthquake that split the ground beneath my feet. I stared at her hand, inches from mine. The hand that once smoothed my hair in that hospital bed. The hand that waved goodbye without meaning it. The hand that had left me to fend for myself. My throat tightened with unspeakable rage, sorrow, and longing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her how her absence had carved holes in me that no one could fill. I wanted to tell her about the birthdays I spent alone, the foster homes that treated me like baggage, the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why I was not enough. I wanted to tell her about Rivera, about loss, about how I had built myself into a soldier because she had left me with no choice. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with years of silence. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Why now?" She flinched as if struck. "Because I am dying," she whispered. "Cancer. I do not have much time left. I cannot leave this world without telling you I am sorry." The words hit me harder than I expected. Dying. Sorry. The mother who abandoned me was not only back, she was fading again, this time to something permanent. I felt the air leave my lungs. Do you know that feeling when someone from your past suddenly reappears and turns your entire world upside down? Maybe it was a parent, a friend, a lover. Did you let them back in, or did you keep the walls up? If you are willing, share your story below. Your words might resonate with someone facing the same choice. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, staring at the woman who had once been my whole world. She was pleading, broken, desperate. And inside me, a battle raged. One voice whispered, "Forgive her. She is human, flawed, dying. She is still your mother." Another voice screamed, "Do not give her what she took from you. Do not let her back in just because she is sorry now." I pressed my palms flat against the table, grounding myself. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. The cafe noise faded into a dull hum. All I could hear was the sound of her sobbing, the sound of my own breath catching in my throat. For the first time in 12 years, I was not abandoned. I was the one holding the power to stay or walk away. I left the cafe that day with my hands shaking so badly I could hardly unlock my car. The sight of her face, the sound of her voice, the tears that spilled onto the table, it all replayed in loops, refusing to let me breathe. The desert dust of deployment had barely settled on my skin, and now I was pulled back into a storm I thought I had outrun. Driving home, my chest burned with questions. Was it mercy to see her again, or was it cruelty? Could wounds that deep ever close, or were they destined to bleed each time the past came knocking? That night I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the ceiling, my uniform jacket hanging on the chair beside me. Rivera's photo was tucked in my desk drawer, her smile frozen in a moment before the desert stole her away. I whispered her name like a prayer, asking what she would do. Forgive, hold firm, walk away. My words drifted into the silence, unanswered. Sleep never came. Memories pressed against me like ghosts. I saw myself as a 15-year-old in the hospital hallway, watching the clock tick past hours that would never return. I saw foster homes, bags packed and unpacked, nights crying quietly so no one would hear. I saw my mother's face in the cafe, older, broken, begging. My heart churned with rage and pity, fury and grief. Have you ever faced someone who hurt you so deeply that even their apology could not touch the wound? Did you feel torn between the desire for peace and the need to protect yourself? If you have, you know the weight I carried that night. Share your thoughts if you want to. Sometimes your words can help someone else who is struggling with the same impossible choice. The next day, I went for a long run across the base. Each step pounded into the pavement like a drumbeat of anger. My lungs burned, sweat soaked my shirt, but still I ran. I was running from her face, from her plea, from the pull of forgiveness that both tempted and terrified me. I thought if I ran far enough, the questions might stay behind. But when I stopped, doubled over with exhaustion, they were still there, waiting. Over the next week, she called. She left voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. Her voice cracked with apologies, stories of how she had spiraled after leaving me, how depression and poverty had swallowed her whole. She said she had thought about me every day. She said she loved me. She said she could not leave this world without hearing me say I forgave her. I listened once, then deleted the rest. Her words scraped at my heart, but I could not decide if they were balm or poison. One evening I sat with Mr. Jacobs, who had long since retired but still kept in touch. We met for dinner at a quiet diner, and he asked about the shadows in my eyes. When I told him, he listened without interruption, his hands folded on the table. When I finished, he sighed. Lily, forgiveness is not for the other person. It is for you, but it is also not an obligation. You get to decide what peace looks like for you. His words sank deep, but they did not make the choice easier. I wanted peace, but I also wanted justice for that girl who had sat alone in the hospital hallway. Did forgiving erase her suffering? Did refusing forgiveness mean I was chained to bitterness forever? That night I dreamed of Rivera. We were sitting outside the barracks, the desert sky above us. She laughed, her voice full and strong, and said, "You carry too much weight, Lily. Let some of it go." I woke with tears streaming down my face, unsure if my mind was trying to trick me or if Rivera's spirit had found a way to whisper across the divide. I want to ask you, if someone you lost could speak to you now, what do you think they would say? Would they tell you to let go, to hold on, to forgive, to fight? Share it if you wish. Sometimes imagining their voice can bring clarity we cannot find alone. The next time my mother called, I answered. My voice was steady, though my heart raced. She sobbed with relief, stumbling over her words, begging me to meet her again. I agreed, though every fiber of me trembled with uncertainty. We met at the same cafe. She looked worse than before, her skin pale, her frame thinner. The illness was eating her alive. She reached for my hands across the table, but I pulled back, folding them in my lap. She told me about her sickness, about the treatments that had failed, about the short time left. She wept as she confessed how fear and despair had driven her choices years ago. She begged again, her voice breaking. "Lily, just one word. Call me Mom. Forgive me once." I stared at her, my chest tight with fury and sorrow. I thought of every foster home, every lonely birthday, every ache of being unwanted. I thought of the desert, of Rivera, of the strength I had built piece by piece. And I realized something. My life was not built on her abandonment. It was built on my survival, on my choices, on the family I had found in others. For the first time, I felt the power shift entirely into my hands. She could beg, but she could not decide for me. I rose slowly, pushing my chair back. She looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes. My throat ached with unshed tears, my fists clenched at my sides. I leaned close enough that she could hear the steadiness in my voice. You left me once, and I died that night. But I was reborn. I found my family and my comrades. I found strength in myself. I do not need you to be whole. Her sobs filled the cafe, but I did not falter. I want to pause here and ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have reached across the table or walked away? There is no right or wrong answer, only the truth of your own heart. Share your thoughts in the comments. They might help someone else wrestling with their own decision. I turned, my boots striking the floor in steady rhythm, and walked out. Behind me, she wept. Ahead of me, the sky stretched wide and open. For the first time in my life, I did not feel abandoned. I felt free. The cafe was silent in the wake of my words. My mother's sobs echoed in the small space, drawing uneasy glances from strangers. Her shoulders shook, her face crumpled, but I remained standing, rooted in a calm that surprised even me. For so long, I had dreamed of this confrontation. In my darkest nights, I had imagined what I would say if she ever reappeared. Sometimes I pictured myself screaming, hurling every ounce of pain at her like stones. Other times, I imagined falling into her arms, desperate for the embrace I had been denied. But in reality, when the moment came, neither rage nor longing ruled me. What ruled me was clarity. I drew in a breath, steadying my voice. The words I had carried for years finally found their way to the surface. The day you left me in that hospital, I died. I waited for you until the clock told me the truth. You were not coming back. Her hands covered her face, muffling her cries, but I did not stop. I had to speak it all for the girl who never had a voice that night. But death was not the end for me. It was the beginning. I rebuilt myself from nothing. I found family in my comrades, strength in the Air Force, and purpose in service. I rose from that death stronger than I ever thought I could be. Her eyes lifted, wet and red, searching my face for a crack of mercy. I shook my head slowly. I do not need forgiveness to be at peace. I am not driven by hate, but I no longer need you to complete me. Her mouth opened, trembling with words that never came. I think she finally understood that the girl she abandoned was gone, replaced by a woman who had walked through fire and emerged unbroken. Do you know that moment when you finally say what has been buried for years, when your truth is heavier than silence, and yet somehow lighter once spoken? It feels like shedding armor you have carried too long. If you have lived that release, share it. Your story could be the mirror someone else needs. I expected to feel triumph, but what came instead was sorrow, not for myself, but for her. For the years she had wasted, the love she had squandered, the memories she had never made. I had mourned her long ago. She was only just beginning to mourn what she had lost. I straightened, the weight of my uniform pressing steady against my shoulders. I remembered Rivera, remembered the promise I had made to live for both of us. I remembered the girl in J-Rock who had found her voice, the young airman who had learned trust in the desert, the soldier who had endured grief and kept moving. I was all of them, carrying every version of myself forward. The silence stretched until I finally said, I do not hate you, but I cannot give you what you ask. She collapsed into sobs, her body folding into itself as if she could vanish inside her regret. I watched for a moment, my chest heavy but unyielding. Then I turned. Each step away felt like shedding chains I did not know still bound me. The door opened, sunlight spilling across my face, and I stepped into the brightness with my head held high. Behind me, she cried. Ahead of me, the world waited. Do you believe forgiveness is necessary for healing, or do you believe healing can come without it? I want to know your thoughts. Share them in the comments. Your perspective could help someone wrestling with their own scars. As I walked down the street, I thought about the journey that had led me here. The girl abandoned in a hospital, the foster child searching for belonging, the cadet finding rhythm in drill, the airman carrying loss in the desert, the daughter confronted with the past. Each chapter had carved me into the woman I was now. And though pain had been my first teacher, resilience had been my final lesson. That night, alone in my small apartment, I lit a candle for Rivera. I whispered that I had spoken my truth. I whispered that I was free. I imagined her laugh, the defiance in her eyes, and I knew she would have been proud. I want to pause here to ask you something tender. If you could speak to the person you lost, what would you tell them today? Would you tell them you miss them, or that you are living in a way that honors them? Share it if you wish. Speaking those words out loud, even here, can bring a measure of peace. I did not know what would happen to my mother after that day. Whether she lived weeks or months longer, whether she carried my words like daggers or like release. But I knew that I had closed a chapter that had haunted me for over a decade. I had spoken the truth, and the truth had set me free. The street outside the cafe stretched before me like a new chapter waiting to be written. The air was cool, the sun dipping low enough to scatter gold across the pavement. Each step I took felt deliberate, steady, as though the weight of years was falling away behind me. For 12 years I had carried the ghost of abandonment. Every decision, every fear, every hope had been marked by that night in the hospital. Even in my strongest moments, I felt her absence like a scar beneath the skin. But walking away now, my boots firm against the ground, I realized I was no longer tethered to that memory. I had faced her. I had spoken my truth, and I had chosen myself. The soldier in me recognized the power of that moment. We often speak of victories on the battlefield, but some of the fiercest battles are fought in quiet cafes, in hushed conversations with the past. And some of the most profound victories come not from conquering others, but from refusing to be conquered by our own wounds. Do you know what it feels like to walk away stronger than you thought possible? To choose yourself after years of feeling powerless? If you have lived that moment, I invite you to share it. Your story might remind someone else that walking away can be as brave as staying. I walked past shop windows, catching glimpses of myself in the glass. A uniformed woman with shoulders squared, eyes clear, steps unbroken. Not the child left behind. Not the foster girl shuffling from house to house. Not even the young recruit desperate to prove she belonged. What I saw was a woman forged in resilience, carrying both the grief and the strength of her journey with equal measure. I thought of my comrades, of Rivera's laughter, her fire, of the countless others who had stood beside me in drills, in deserts, in silence heavy with both fear and hope. They were my family, my foundation, the proof that belonging could be found not in blood, but in loyalty and shared sacrifice. As I walked, I whispered the words I had not spoken aloud in the cafe. I do not hate you. I do not forgive you, but I am free. The wind carried them away, scattering them like seeds. And in their place, I felt something new take root. Peace. Not the fragile peace of forgetting, but the steady peace of surviving. That night I stood before the mirror. My uniform neatly hung for the next day. My reflection steady and unflinching. I thought of the 15-year-old girl who had once stared at her own reflection in a hospital bathroom, tears streaking her face, wondering what she had done to deserve being left behind. If she could see me now, I thought, she would know she had never been worthless. She had always been destined for more. I want to ask you to imagine this. If you could speak to your younger self, the one who endured the hardest moment of your life, what would you tell them? Would you tell them they would survive? Would you tell them they were loved, even if not by the person they longed for? Share it if you feel called to. Your words might be exactly what someone else's younger self needs to hear today. The days that followed were quiet. I heard no more from my mother. I did not search for updates, though sometimes I wondered if she had slipped away into that final silence she feared. But even without closure from her, I had found closure within myself. I poured my energy back into my duties, into the rhythm of base life. Morning runs, logistics briefings, the hum of engines on the tarmac. The world kept turning and I kept moving with it. Not as a woman defined by abandonment, but as a soldier defined by strength. One evening, during a base ceremony, I stood with my fellow service members as the flag was raised, the anthem echoing across the field. My chest swelled with pride, my throat tightening with emotion. I thought of Rivera. I thought of every fallen comrade. I thought of the girl who had walked away from her mother and into freedom. And I understood that the truest revenge was not hate, not even forgiveness. It was living a life so strong, so steady, that nothing could diminish it. Do you believe that strength can be a form of justice? That the best way to rise above betrayal is to live fully, without chains? If you agree, or even if you see it differently, share your heart. These stories are stronger when they are shared, because no one carries their burdens alone here. The story of my life is not one of abandonment. It is one of resurrection, of dying in a hospital hallway and being reborn in boots and uniform, of losing a sister in arms and choosing to carry her spirit forward, of facing the ghost of my mother and walking away whole. The last time I saw her face, she was bent in grief, but I was standing tall. And that is the image I carry, not her tears, but my stride. Straight, steady, unbroken. As I close this chapter, I want to leave you with this. You are not defined by who left you, by who failed to love you, by the scars carved by others. You are defined by how you rise, by how you choose to keep moving, by the strength you build from the ashes. If this story has touched you, if you see yourself in my journey, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story in the comments. Together we can honor the resilience of every woman, every soldier, every person who has carried pain and turned it into power. Because in the end, survival is not the final victory. Living fully, freely, and without apology, that is the sweetest victory of all. There are wounds that time does not erase. Wounds that do not close with a single apology or even with forgiveness. Some scars remain, etched into us like a map of where we have been. But scars are not the end of the story. They are proof of survival. They remind us that even when we were broken, we healed in our own way. For me, the abandonment in that hospital hallway will always be part of my past. The silence of waiting for footsteps that never came will never be forgotten. But what I have learned is this. Healing does not always mean reconciling. Peace does not always come from the one who hurt you. Sometimes peace is born when you choose to keep walking, when you refuse to let the wound define your future. The sweetest revenge is not hate. It is not even forgiveness. The sweetest revenge is to live a life so full, so steady, so meaningful, that nothing from the past can diminish it. To live with courage, with dignity, with freedom. That is where strength lives. That is where survival becomes victory. If you have ever been hurt, if you carry scars that still ache when you touch them, let me say this to you. You are not a victim forever. You are not broken beyond repair. You are capable of rising, of becoming more than the pain that tried to hold you down. You can become a warrior in the story of your own life. You can take the chapters written in sorrow and turn them into a book of resilience. I know some of you listening have walked through fire yourselves. Some of you have endured betrayal, abandonment, grief. Some of you may still be waiting for answers that never came. If you feel comfortable, share a piece of that in the comments. Your words might remind someone else that they are not alone, that their story matters too. And if you are still in the middle of your battle, still searching for the strength to take the next step, hold on to this truth. You are stronger than you think. Even if you cannot see it yet, every breath you take in defiance of despair is proof of your resilience. Every small step forward is an act of victory. As I close this story, I hope you carry its message with you. That strength is not found in erasing the past, but in refusing to be ruled by it. That even the deepest wounds can become the soil where courage grows. That you are not powerless. no matter what you have endured. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Every week, we bring new stories of women in uniform, stories of resilience, sacrifice, and triumph. Stories that honor the courage it takes not only to serve in the military, but to serve life itself with strength and dignity. By subscribing, you are not just following a channel, you are joining a community that believes in the power of survival, the pride of service, and the unshakable spirit of women who refuse to be broken. Together, we can honor their journeys, share our own, and remind each other that no one stands alone. Because at the heart of every story we tell here lies this truth. We are more than what was done to us. We are more than the battles we have fought. We are the victories we claim when we rise again and again, no matter how many times life has tried to push us down. So let us rise together. Let us honor the scars. Let us keep walking forward with courage and hope. And let us remember that the bravest thing we can do is to live a life worthy of the battles we have survived.